The hurricane didn't just hit Cypress Haven, it erased it. Roofs peeled off like paper. Palm trees snapped and blocked the roads. Floodwater pushed through living rooms and carried people's lives out to sea. By morning, the neighborhood looked like something abandoned, not survived. And then there was my house. No broken windows. No collapsed walls. The waterline stopped short of my front steps. It stood there solid and quiet, like it had been built for exactly this moment. I didn't feel proud. I felt sick. I ran extension cords across the mud so neighbors could charge their phones. I handed out water from my garage. People sat on my porch in silence, staring at what was left of their homes. No one talked about why my house was still standing. Not yet. 3 days later, I found a thick packet taped to my gate. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a fine. It was a lawsuit. The HOA claimed my elevated foundation had diverted floodwater into other homes. They called it adverse water displacement. Their solution wasn't compensation. It was demolition. They wanted the court to declare my house a hazard and order it torn down for the safety of the community. I stood there in ankle-deep mud, reading it over and over, trying to understand how surviving a hurricane had turned me into a threat. That was when it hit me. The storm was over, but something far more dangerous had just begun. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I didn't build my house to prove a point. I built it because I had spent too many years watching storms turn small design decisions into catastrophes. I worked around water my whole life. I knew how surge behaves when it meets flat slabs, how floodwater looks for the lowest resistance, how most homes fail, not because the storm is extraordinary, but because the planning is ordinary. That's why, years earlier, when I bought the parcel just outside the Seabrook Preserve subdivision, I made one decision that irritated a lot of people before they ever met me. I refused to join the HOA, not out of spite, out of caution. I wanted control over elevation, drainage, materials, and reinforcement. The HOA rules favored uniformity and curb appeal. I favored physics. So I raised the foundation higher than required, graded the land to move water away from the structure, poured reinforced concrete instead of wood framing, and anchored everything to meet standards most residential builders considered excessive. Every permit was approved, every inspection passed. County engineers signed off on the drainage plan. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was rushed. That didn't matter to the HOA. Marianne Holloway introduced herself to me before the house was even finished. She didn't threaten me. She didn't lecture. She smiled and talked about harmony, about how neighborhoods work best when everyone makes the same choices, about how deviation creates risk. "You can't design just for yourself," she said once, standing at the edge of my lot and gesturing toward the subdivision. "Not when you're this close to other people." I told her I wasn't designing for myself. I was designing for the storm. She nodded like she understood, but her expression told me she didn't agree. In her mind, preparedness wasn't a personal responsibility. It was a collective one. And anyone who stepped outside that framework wasn't independent. They were disruptive. For a long time, that disagreement stayed theoretical. A few tense conversations. Some pointed comments at community meetings I attended as an observer. Nothing more. Then the hurricane came and turned theory into evidence. When the floodwater receded and my house was still standing, the conversation changed. Not immediately. At first there was shock, then relief, then confusion, and finally something harder to name: comparison. People started walking the perimeter of my property, tracing the slope of the land with their eyes, looking at the height of the foundation. Not accusing yet, just noticing, asking questions. Why didn't the water reach his door? Why did it pool over there but not here? Why did his place look untouched? Those questions didn't come from malice. They came from loss. And loss looks for explanations. That's when Marianne stepped back in, this time not as a neighbor, but as a leader. She called emergency HOA meetings and spoke in calm, measured tones about responsibility. She never said my name at first. She talked about systems, about unintended consequences, about how, in disasters, even well-meaning decisions can have ripple effects. Water has to go somewhere, she said more than once. When one property changes the flow, another absorbs the cost. It sounded reasonable. It almost made sense. The HOA hired an outside consultant to do a preliminary assessment, not a full study, just enough to generate language, phrases like altered drainage patterns and localized displacement. They didn't conclude anything definitively, but they didn't need to. The suggestion alone was enough. When the legal filing arrived, it wasn't emotional. It was clinical. The HOA alleged that my elevated foundation and grading had exacerbated flooding on adjacent properties by redirecting surge water. They cited adverse water displacement, a real concept, wrapped in enough technical wording to feel authoritative. They weren't asking for damages. They were asking the court to intervene, to force remediation, to restore natural flow, to remove the structure if necessary. Reading it, my hands went cold. Not because I thought they were right, but because I knew how dangerous, reasonable accusations can be. This wasn't about blaming me for surviving. It was about reframing survival as harm. Marianne called me that same day. She didn't accuse me. She didn't gloat. She sounded tired. "I know this feels personal," she said, "but it's not. This is about preventing it from happening again." She talked about the next storm, about liability, about how if another surge came and the same pattern repeated, the HOA would be blamed for doing nothing. She said leadership meant making hard choices before someone else got hurt. In a crisis, she said, individual solutions become collective problems. I realized then that she wasn't lying to herself. She truly believed she was protecting the neighborhood. That tearing down my house wasn't punishment, but prevention. That made her far more dangerous than someone acting out of greed. Because you can argue with greed, you can negotiate with it. But when someone believes they are morally correct, evidence becomes an obstacle, not a guide. As word spread about the lawsuit, the mood shifted again. Not toward anger, but toward pressure. Quiet pressure. Quiet pressure. People started telling me they understood both sides, that maybe I should compromise, that maybe rebuilding together mattered more than being technically right. I listened. I understood their fear, but I also knew something they didn't yet. If I accepted their premise, if I allowed my house to be labeled a hazard without proof, then the truth would never matter again, not for me. Not for anyone else who dared to prepare differently. That was when I realized the storm hadn't created this conflict. It had simply revealed it. And if I didn't push back now, the next disaster wouldn't just take houses. It would take choice. Once the lawsuit was filed, everything accelerated. What had been quiet conversations and cautious suggestions turned into official notices and procedural pressure. The HOA didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They buried me in paper. Motions, assessments, and formal letters arrived almost daily, each one framed as a necessary step to protect the community. They ordered a preliminary drainage review without notifying me. Then they circulated a summary, not the full report, highlighting phrases like potential displacement and unintended downstream effects. No conclusions. No causation, just enough uncertainty to sound alarming. That uncertainty spread faster than any rumor. Someone flew a drone over my property and posted the images online. From above, my house looked like an island in a sea of damage. The caption didn't accuse me of anything. It just asked a question. How is this possible? The comments did the rest. Neighbors who had sat on my porch charging their phones began avoiding me. Not out of anger, but discomfort. It's hard to look someone in the eye when you're afraid the answer might implicate you too. A local radio show picked up the story and started calling my place the elevated house, discussing it like a curiosity, then a concern. Marianne went on the air shortly after. She spoke carefully, choosing words that framed her position as reluctant but necessary. She said disasters expose interconnectedness, that no property exists in isolation when water moves. That leadership sometimes means asking one person to sacrifice so others don't suffer again. She never said demolition. She said mitigation. She never said blame. She said responsibility. And people listened, because what she said almost made sense. Then came the formal escalation. The HOA filed for a temporary injunction, asking the court to restrict any repairs or modifications to my house until the case was resolved. That meant I couldn't reinforce, adjust grading, or even make certain fixes without approval. My home was intact, but now it was frozen in place, treated like evidence instead of shelter. That's when the fear set in, not panic. Something colder. If the injunction went through, the next step would be expert testimony, then a ruling on whether my house constituted a continuing hazard. The word demolition wasn't in the filing yet, but it was implied, clear enough that Evan didn't soften it when he explained the stakes. They're building toward it, he said, slowly, deliberately. The pressure wasn't just legal, it was social. Neighbors started coming to me privately, asking if I would consider settling. Not because they believed the HOA was right, but because they were tired. Every letter, every meeting, every update reopened wounds. The community was still rebuilding, and now there was a lawsuit threatening to stretch on for years. "You're probably right," one man told me, standing in the remains of his garage, "but being right doesn't help us sleep." I understood him. That was the hardest part. The HOA didn't need to convince everyone I was dangerous. They just needed enough people to decide the fight itself was the problem. That way, if I lost, it would feel inevitable. And if I won, it would still feel selfish. Marianne called again around that time. This time, she didn't talk about policies. She talked about children, about elderly residents, about what would happen if another storm came before the case was resolved. "We can't afford another mistake," she said, "and we can't afford exceptions." She said my preparation had created an imbalance. That when everyone else followed the same rules, one person choosing differently undermined the system. Uniformity is what keeps people safe, she said. Not individual optimization. I realized then that she wasn't escalating because she hated me. She was escalating because backing down would mean admitting her worldview had limits. That night, I walked the edge of my property where the grading sloped away, the same slope engineers had approved years earlier. I could still see the high water marks on nearby homes. I could still smell the mold and salt in the air. I replayed every decision I had made during construction. Every permit, every inspection, every choice. Nothing had been done in secret. But none of that mattered if perception won. Evan and I talked late into the night. He didn't sugarcoat it. "If we fight this," he said, "they'll paint you as the obstacle to healing. If you settle, they'll treat it as confirmation." Either way, the pressure would intensify before it broke. That was when Evan made a decision that felt counterintuitive. He told me to stop responding. No public statements. No arguments at meetings. No explanations to neighbors. Let the HOA keep talking. Let them commit to a story. "They believe they're right," he said. "People who believe that tend to get careless." For the first time since the hurricane, I felt like the ground was shifting beneath the fight. Not in my favor yet, but away from chaos and toward something measurable. The storm had taken away certainty. Now the HOA was doing the same. And I was about to find out which one left more wreckage behind. Evan didn't respond to the injunction request right away. He didn't issue statements. He didn't challenge Marianne's narrative in public. Instead, he went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, almost unsettling. That's when he started pulling threads. The HOA's entire case rested on one idea: that my house had altered the natural flow of water. Everything else, the injunction, the talk of mitigation, the moral language about sacrifice, depended on that claim holding up under scrutiny. So Evan didn't argue philosophy, he argued math. He requested the HOA's own documentation, not summaries, not consultant slides, the raw materials, contracts, invoices, banking records tied to the so-called disaster response. If they were acting in good faith, the paper would reflect it. It didn't. The first red flag was small but impossible to ignore. An invoice labeled Emergency Tarping, Phase 1. Evan stared at the date for a long time before sliding it across the table to me. It was dated 3 weeks before the hurricane had even formed in the Atlantic. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error, but then he found another. Fuel charges for post-surge cleanup mobilization, logged on a day when the weather had been calm and clear. Then another line item referencing temporary displacement housing coordination, again dated before any evacuation order existed. These weren't mistakes, they were preparations. Evan traced the payments next. The money didn't go directly to contractors. It passed through an intermediary account tied to an entity called the Cypress Rebuild Committee. The name sounded official, almost comforting. It also didn't legally exist. No registration, no tax filings, no corporate history. The more Evan dug, the clearer the pattern became. Funds were being moved early, quietly, and without disclosure. The hurricane didn't create the system, it activated it. While he worked, the pressure outside increased. Unmarked vehicles began parking near my gate for short stretches of time. Not long enough to justify a call, just long enough to be noticed. One morning, 2 of my exterior cameras were offline, not damaged. Disabled. Someone had known exactly where to cut. Notes started appearing, slipped under the gate, tucked into the fence line, always handwritten, always vague. Do the right thing. This doesn't have to get worse. No names. No threats explicit enough to report, just enough to remind me I was being watched. For the first time, doubt crept in, not about whether I was right, but about whether fighting was worth the cost. The HOA wasn't just threatening my house anymore. It was squeezing the space around me, making everyday life feel smaller and more fragile. That's when Evan told me to start gathering everything. Not just construction records, but context. Permits, elevation certificates, engineering reports showing pre- and post-construction water modeling, emails from county officials approving the drainage plan, photos taken during the build showing how the grading directed water away from neighboring lots, not toward them. I spread it all out on my dining table, organizing years of decisions into a timeline that told a very different story than the HOA's filings. My house hadn't altered natural flow. It had respected it. The narrative Marianne was selling depended on vagueness, on fear, on the idea that most people wouldn't know enough to question technical claims delivered confidently. But documents don't care how confident someone sounds. They care about dates, signatures, and consistency. And the HOA had none. Evan assembled everything into folders, each one labeled with brutal simplicity. Insurance representations, financial transfers, pre-event expenditures, attempted annexation authority, harassment patterns. This isn't just a defense anymore, he said. It's a counterweight. The realization hit me slowly but completely. Marianne still believed she was guiding the community through chaos. She still believed uniformity was safety and dissent was danger. But in her certainty, she had moved too fast, planned too early, left fingerprints where none should exist. She thought she was preventing the next disaster. She didn't realize she was documenting her own. By the time Evan finished, The fear that had followed me since the storm began to change shape. It didn't disappear, but it sharpened into focus. This wasn't about opinion or interpretation anymore. It was about intent versus reality. The HOA's story was starting to crack, and cracks spread fastest when pressure keeps building. The first person to reach out did it quietly, the way people do when they're afraid of being seen. He waited until dusk, then called from a blocked number and asked if we could talk somewhere neutral. His voice shook the entire time. His name was Caleb Morris. He had worked part-time for the HOA during the rebuild, helping reconcile invoices and track emergency expenses. Not high enough to make decisions, but close enough to notice patterns that didn't sit right. We met in the parking lot of a closed grocery store, both of us sitting in our cars with the windows cracked. He passed me a manila envelope through the gap like it might burn him if he held it too long. Inside were copies of invoices, bank transfer confirmations, and internal memos he had printed before quitting. One page stopped me cold. An invoice for emergency tarping, Phase 1, dated weeks before the hurricane existed. Another listed fuel charges for cleanup equipment on a day when the sky had been clear and the ocean calm. Caleb didn't make accusations. He didn't need to. I kept telling myself I was missing something, he said, but the dates never lined up. And when I asked questions, they told me not to worry about it. He left after that, shoulders tight, like someone finally setting down a weight they'd been carrying alone. 2 days later, the second crack split the case wide open. Lena Price, the HOA's current treasurer, contacted Evan directly. She didn't ask for immunity or favors. She asked for a meeting. When she arrived, she looked exhausted in a way sleep doesn't fix. She placed a small flash drive on the table and slid it forward. "I can't be part of this anymore," she said. The drive contained internal emails, budget drafts, and board discussions that were never meant to leave closed rooms. Conversations about pre-event positioning, about how framing the lawsuit as safety instead of punishment would make resistance look reckless, about how long public sympathy would last before people demanded someone be held accountable. There was no villain laughter, no cartoon cruelty, just calm, strategic planning carried out by people who believed the ends justified the means. Lena resigned that same day. At that point, Evan stopped reacting and started building something deliberate. He treated the case less like a dispute and more like an exposure timeline. Every document was logged, every email cross-referenced, every inconsistency highlighted. We filed complaints quietly. No press. No announcements. The insurance commission received copies of invoices dated before the storm. The county zoning office received documentation showing that the HOA had no authority to declare my property a hazard without an independent hydrological study. The State Fraud Division received transaction metadata showing money moved in anticipation of an event that hadn't happened yet. Each filing stood on its own. Clean. Factual. Impossible to dismiss as emotion or retaliation. While all of this moved beneath the surface, the HOA pushed harder above it. Cease and desist letters arrived accusing me of interfering with recovery efforts. Threats of liens followed, warning that my non-cooperation was delaying healing. The language grew sharper, less careful, as if urgency justified shortcuts. Marianne believed pressure would finally break me. She didn't know that every letter, every demand, every attempt to silence me was being added to the record. Each one reinforced the same pattern, not leadership but coercion, not protection but control. The pressure was intense, but it was no longer frightening. Fear thrives on uncertainty, and for the first time since the hurricane, things were becoming very clear. The HOA wasn't reacting to my house. They were defending a plan that had started long before the wind picked up. By the time Marianne realized she wasn't tightening a grip but tightening a noose, the structure she relied on to protect her was already starting to give. The trap wasn't sprung yet, but it was fully built. The hearing didn't feel dramatic when it began. No shouting, no gasps. just the low hum of a courtroom settling into routine. Mary Ann sat at the front table with her attorneys, posture straight, hands folded, the same calm expression she had worn through every interview and meeting. If you didn't know the backstory, you might have believed she was there to defend something fragile and good. Evan let her go first. That wasn't an accident. Mary Ann testified slowly and carefully, speaking in the language of stewardship and necessity. She explained how the HOA had acted only after the hurricane, how funds were mobilized in response to immediate need, how decisions were made under pressure to prevent further harm. She talked about responsibility in a crisis, about how leaders sometimes have to make unpopular choices to protect the many from the actions of the few. Then she gave dates, specific ones. She said the disaster response accounts were activated after landfall. She said transfers occurred only once damage assessments were complete. She said there had been no planning before the storm because no one could have known what was coming. She sounded reasonable. Convincing, even. When Evan stood, he didn't challenge her tone or her intentions. He asked for clarification. He repeated her answers back to her slowly, giving her room to confirm them under oath. Then he asked permission to display a single document. It was a bank transfer record. Nothing flashy, just a line of text, a timestamp, and a routing number. The date sat there in plain sight, unremarkable until you understood what it meant. 3 weeks before the hurricane had even formed in the Atlantic. Evan asked her to read the date aloud. She did. He asked if that date preceded the storm. She hesitated, then nodded. He displayed another record, and another. Each one showed money moving out of HOA accounts into the same intermediary, all before there was any emergency to respond to. Each one directly contradicted the timeline she had just sworn to. The room didn't explode. It went quiet in a way that felt heavy, like air being pulled out. Mary Ann's attorneys leaned toward her, whispering urgently. She stared at the screen, then at the judge, as if searching for a way to reframe what everyone could now see clearly. But dates don't bend. Metadata doesn't care about intent. Evan didn't accuse her of lying. He didn't need to. He simply asked if her earlier testimony was still accurate in light of the records. She didn't answer right away. That pause said more than anything else. From there, the case unraveled quickly. Evan walked through the adverse water displacement claim methodically, introducing independent engineering reports that showed my grading followed natural flow paths approved years earlier. He contrasted that with the HOA's consultant summary, which lacked modeling, lacked measurements, and relied on conditional language instead of conclusions. Potential, not proven. May have, not did. The injunction request started to look less like prevention and more like pressure. But the moment that cut deepest didn't come from Evan. It came during a brief recess. A small group of neighbors approached me in the hallway. Not the angry ones, the tired ones. People who had lost roofs, savings, sleep. They spoke quietly, almost apologetically, and asked if there was any way I could settle. Not because they believed the HOA was right, but because the legal fight was draining what little resources the community had left. One woman said, "We know you didn't cause this, but this is tearing everything apart." I stood there listening, feeling the weight of it all pressed down at once. For the first time, the certainty I'd carried cracked. Not about the facts, but about the cost. Being right suddenly felt heavier than being liked. Standing my ground meant standing alone in a room full of people who just wanted the pain to stop. When court resumed, I sat back down with that doubt still burning in my chest. Evan noticed. He didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. He finished by addressing the injunction directly. He explained what demolition would mean, not in emotional terms, but in legal ones. An irreversible act based on unproven claims. A precedent that would allow any HOA to label lawful construction a hazard after the fact. He looked at the judge and said simply, "This court doesn't need to decide who people are afraid of. It needs to decide what is true. The judge took notes, asked questions, focused on the records, not the rhetoric. When the session ended, no ruling was issued immediately. The judge said he would review the filings and issue a decision shortly. As we left the courtroom, the pressure returned, sharper than before. Reporters asked questions. Neighbors watched my face for signs of compromise. Marianne passed by without looking at me, her composure intact, but strained at the edges. That night, alone in my house, I stared at the walls I had built to withstand the storm and wondered if holding on to them was costing everyone else too much. By morning, the doubt was still there. But so was the truth. And when the choice came down to being liked or being honest, I knew which one I could live with. The court would decide the rest. The ruling came down without ceremony, and that somehow made it hit harder. The judge didn't lecture. He didn't summarize the drama. He spoke plainly, methodically, as if the outcome had become unavoidable the moment the facts were laid out in order. The HOA had failed to establish causation. The adverse water displacement claim was unsupported by credible evidence. The request for an injunction was denied in full. Then he went further. He ruled that the HOA had no authority to pursue demolition based on speculative harm, that the consultant summary did not meet the standard required to restrict a homeowner's lawful use of their property, that the financial records raised serious concerns about misrepresentation and timing. The words landed one after another, each one stripping away another layer of the HOA's power. By the time he finished, the case wasn't just dismissed. It was exposed. Marianne sat very still as the ruling was read. No reaction, no argument. Just a tightening around the eyes that told me she understood exactly what had happened. The logic she believed would save the neighborhood had collapsed under scrutiny. Not because it was malicious, but because it was built on assumptions instead of proof. Outside the courtroom, the consequences moved faster than anyone expected. Investigators were already waiting, not reporters, not activists, officials. They served notices and secured records before the HOA office could even close for the day. Computers were tagged. Filing cabinets were sealed. Bank accounts tied to the disaster fund were frozen pending review. The authority Marianne had wielded for years evaporated in real time. Phones rang unanswered. Emergency meetings were scheduled and then quietly canceled. Board members who had once spoken confidently about responsibility and unity began resigning, effective immediately, citing health concerns or family obligations. No one wanted to be left holding a title that now came with liability. The neighbors noticed the shift almost instantly. People who had avoided me for months approached slowly, cautiously, like they weren't sure where they stood anymore. Some apologized outright. Others didn't know what to say and didn't try to fill the silence. They just stood there, listening as the truth rearranged everything they thought they understood. Within days, residents began filing their own complaints, not out of revenge, but confusion. They wanted to know where their donations went, why invoices were dated before the storm, why decisions had been framed as emergencies when the paper trail said otherwise. The narrative turned inside out. The HOA had painted me as the exception that endangered the community. Now the community was realizing how often fear had been used to rush consent, how often questions had been discouraged in the name of unity. What once felt like leadership began to look like pressure. Marianne tried to speak once more, issuing a brief statement through counsel about difficult choices and misunderstood intentions. It didn't land, not because people thought she was evil, but because they no longer trusted her certainty. Belief is fragile. Once it breaks, authority follows. The HOA office closed temporarily. The website went offline. Notices stopped appearing on doors. The constant background noise of enforcement warnings and deadlines vanished, leaving behind a strange quiet that felt unfamiliar at first. That evening, I walked my property as the sun dropped low, casting long shadows across the ground where Floodwater had once stood. The same house that had made me a target now felt like shelter again, not just from storms, but from the endless pressure to justify my existence. The HOA hadn't been destroyed by one ruling. It had collapsed under the weight of its own reasoning. They believed uniformity was safety. They believed control prevented chaos. And in trying to enforce that belief without evidence, they created the very instability they claimed to fear. As generators shut down one by one, and the neighborhood slowly returned to something like normal, I realized the irony of it all. The hurricane had tested buildings. The aftermath tested people. And in the end, it wasn't the strongest structure that failed. It was the one built on certainty instead of truth. The fallout didn't come all at once. It unfolded in stages, the way consequences usually do when no one is trying to put on a show. The first sign was financial. HOA accounts were frozen pending investigation, which immediately stalled everything they once relied on to exert control. Automatic withdrawals failed. Vendors stopped getting paid. Contractors who had been promised emergency funds started calling residents directly, confused about why checks weren't clearing. The machinery that had made the HOA feel permanent seized up overnight. Then came the paperwork. A dissolution notice was filed with the county, quiet and unceremonious. No meeting, no vote. Just a legal acknowledgement that the organization could no longer operate in its current form. The HOA didn't go out in flames. It simply stopped existing as an authority. Titles vanished. Enforcement powers evaporated. What had once felt immovable turned out to be held together by filings and belief alone. Criminal investigations followed at a pace that felt both slow and relentless. Requests for information became subpoenas. Subpoenas became interviews. Interviews became sworn statements. People who once spoke confidently about protecting the community stopped answering their phones and started speaking through attorneys instead. The language changed. So did the tone. Through all of it, I didn't celebrate. There was no moment that felt like victory. Too many people were still living in half-repaired homes. Too many lives were still unsettled. Watching the HOA unravel didn't restore what the storm had taken, and it didn't erase the months of tension that followed. If anything, it made the cost of all of it more visible. What it did restore was something quieter. Space. With the pressure gone, conversations changed. People stopped whispering and started asking real questions. Not about me, but about what had been done in their name. Where their donations had gone. Why they had been pushed to support legal action they barely understood at the time. Why dissent had been framed as danger. I went back to doing ordinary things. I repaired fences that had been crushed by debris, helped neighbors clear fallen trees, lent tools, shared contractor contacts. This time, there were no forms to sign, no approvals to seek, no sense that helping someone might later be used as leverage against me. Rebuilding felt different without manipulation hanging over it. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact worked beside me now without awkwardness. Some apologized outright. Others didn't, but showed up anyway, which mattered more. We didn't talk much about court or investigations. We talked about drainage, about elevation, about how to rebuild smarter without turning preparation into suspicion. The absence of the HOA was noticeable in small ways. No sudden notices taped to doors. No emergency meetings called with little warning. No one positioning themselves as the voice of everyone else. Decisions took longer, but they were honest. Messy. Sometimes frustrating, but grounded in reality instead of fear. Every so often, Evan would update me on the investigations. Assets seized. Statements taken. Former board members cooperating. Others lawyering up. There was no sense of revenge in the process, just accountability moving forward, one step at a time. What struck me most was how quickly the constant anxiety faded Once the structure enforcing it disappeared, I stopped checking my gate every morning. I stopped bracing for another letter, another accusation, another attempt to turn preparation into wrongdoing. Life didn't become perfect, but it became livable again. The storm had exposed physical weaknesses, cheap materials, poor planning, systems that failed under pressure. That damage was visible and painful, but understandable. The aftermath exposed something deeper. It showed how easily authority can rot when it feeds on fear instead of responsibility. How quickly grief can be redirected into blame. How dangerous it is when control is mistaken for care. None of that vanished when the HOA dissolved. But it lost its platform. Without bylaws and titles to hide behind, the people who had pushed hardest were forced to answer as individuals. Not leaders, not representatives. Just people explaining choices they had made when others were at their most vulnerable. As the neighborhood slowly recovered, I came to understand something else too. Strength isn't just concrete and elevation, it's transparency. It's documentation. It's the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions when everyone else wants simple answers. My house stood because it was built to face reality. The community began to heal once it stopped letting fear define it. I never set out to be an example. I just wanted a home that would still be there when the water receded. What I learned was that surviving the storm is only half the battle. Surviving what comes after takes patience, clarity, and the refusal to surrender truth just to make things feel easier. And without the weight of corruption pressing down on every decision, rebuilding finally felt like it was moving forward instead of in circles. Months later, I found myself standing near the waterline again, watching the tide move in and out like nothing had ever happened. The debris was gone. The noise was gone. What remained were the quiet markers of recovery, new foundations, fresh lumber, and people who had learned the hard way what really matters when everything gets tested at once. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled, not because I had won anything, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand on its own. Storms are honest. They don't care about intentions or titles. They expose what's solid and what isn't, then move on. People are different. People can twist fear into authority. They can convince themselves that control is the same thing as care, and that breaking one person is justified if it calms everyone else. My house survived because it was built carefully, legally, and without shortcuts. Every decision was documented. Every choice was made with reality in mind, not appearances. The HOA failed for the opposite reason. It relied on certainty instead of evidence, pressure instead of proof, and belief instead of accountability. What this experience taught me is simple, even if living through it wasn't. Preparation beats panic every time. Paper beats intimidation, no matter how confident it sounds. And fear only has power if you agree to carry it. Looking back now, I don't feel anger toward the people who doubted me. I understand how easy it is to want a simple answer when everything feels broken. But I also know this: the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs time, patience, and someone willing to stand still while it catches up. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?